Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeff Craig. Welcome to the 7th seminar in the Deakin Science and Society Network Healthy Futures series. I lead the Early Life Epigenetics group within the Impact Institute School of Medicine at Deakin University. I also lead the Gene Equality Deakin University Research Network. My Gene Equality colleague, Associate Professor Neera Bhatia, and I are organisers of this Healthy Futures seminar series, so welcome. The Science and Society Network was formed in 2018 in recognition that scientists and humanities and social scientist researchers need to work together to meet the great challenges of the century. No single academic field can bring about the changes we need to see in the world. Bridging disciplinary divides is the key to finding new solutions to the problems we face. The Science and Society Network supports early and mid-career researchers across Deakin University who are embarking on groundbreaking interdisciplinary projects. I would like to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the traditional custodians of the land on which each of us are on today. I would like to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. Let us pause to learn, acknowledge, and celebrate their ancient histories and cultures. I myself are on Wadawurrung country down here in Ocean Grove, not far from Deakin One Ponds campus. For those who have not attended one of our seminars so far, a quick rundown on the structure of today's event. I'll introduce our speaker, Professor Margaret Otlowski. Margaret will present for around 40 minutes, and then we'll have some discussion comments from Dr. Larry Croft and Dr. Loretta Duplevitz before we throw to general discussion and questions and answers from the audience. We really welcome your questions. I'll be chairing here on Zoom, and my colleague Karina Traits will be moderating the YouTube live chat. We're keen to hear and answer your questions, so you can either post questions into YouTube chat, send us on Twitter at SSN Deakin. Make sure you use the hashtag SSN Seminar and hashtag Healthy Futures, or email ssn-info@deakin.edu.au. So I'm delighted to introduce Margaret Otlowski from the University of Tasmania. Margaret is focused on the relationship between the law, health, and ethics. She is passionate about protecting people from harm in this era. Reviewing laws and recommending change in light of new ethical questions is a fundamental aspect of her work. Professor Otlowski has served as an expert and high-level policy advisor to the government, as a member of the Australian Health Ethics Committee and the Human Genetics Advisory Committee, both of which principal committees of the National Health and Medical Research Council. Professor Otlowski was appointed chair of the working group responsible for rewriting the chapter on genetics in the NHMRC's national statement. Margaret has published extensively in the field of health law and bioethics, including a book with Oxford University Press in the UK, Voluntary Euthanasia and the Common Law. A number of monographs, book chapters in national and international publications, and more than 80 peer-reviewed publications in referee journals. She has also published numerous publications for professional journals as well as conference proceedings. So Margaret, welcome, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Jeff, for the introduction and a kind welcome. I'm just going to organise to share my screen and commence my... Is that showing as the slideshow yet or not yet? From the beginning? There, that's it.
Yeah, there we go.
Excellent. Well, perhaps everyone's already familiar in broad terms, but I'd like to commence by saying that the use of genetic tests by life insurers has been a contested issue for some time in Australia, as has the concern about genetic discrimination in life insurance. So in this talk, what I'd like to do is set out the current legal position, the problems that I see with it, the voluntary moratorium that's been introduced by the life insurance industry, and then turn to look at a current research project which I'm involved with, which is monitoring the effectiveness of this moratorium. So to ask the question, well, why is this an issue and why now? We know there's been a lot of emphasis on the importance of mainstreaming genomics into healthcare, as acknowledged by this National Health Genomics Policy Framework. And the benefits of this, of course, are clear, but there has likewise been recognition of the potential for genomic or genetic discrimination, and that this needs to be a priority area of action if we are to realise the benefits of genomics in healthcare. Another factor, of course, has been the advancements. We've moved from having merely genetic tests to now whole genome sequencing. So the amount of information that is available through genetic and genomic testing is now enormous. And we know that not everything is interpretable. What it actually means is the potential for misinterpretation of information, potentially to the detriment of consumers, is probably greater now than it ever has been. So in terms of setting the scene, sorry, beg your pardon, setting the scene, I've just got to get my little clicker better. Setting the scene, of course, there are a couple of key things we need to get clear. And the first is actually defining what we're talking about, that we're talking about genetic discrimination, and that this is a very particular, very specific type of discrimination. It can be defined as differential treatment of asymptomatic individuals on the basis of their actual or presumed genetic characteristics. So central to this is the fact that people do not have symptoms. Rather, what it is that through genetic testing, they are indicated as being predisposed to a disease based on a genetic mutation that testing reveals. So the crux of it is that it's discrimination on the basis of genetic status rather than an existing disability. In terms of the context where these situations arise, typically family history of, say, familial breast cancer will be the indicator for a person to have clinical genetic testing, and that may then lead to a predictive test and information through a result about whether or not they are predisposed to that mutation. My focus here is very much on life insurance in genetic discrimination. This is important to emphasise because health insurance is not in scope because it's community rated, which means health insurers must treat all people on the same basis. They don't undertake this risk assessment based on the person's health status. When it comes to life insurers, however, it's been a routine part of assessing people for eligibility and terms of cover to look at their health, their their diseases and so on, to assess what cover they would be offered. To put in context, life insurance is a product that probably fewer than a third of Australians would seek. When we talk about individual cover as opposed to group cover, for example, that's available as packages through insurance and which doesn't have this same individual risk assessment. But nevertheless, for those who want this financial security, it is an important product. And to understand this area in context, it's also important to be aware that applicants have a duty to provide information to an insurer. So if they have had a genetic test or other medical information that's relevant, they are obligated to disclose it. And this is because insurance contracts are contracts of utmost good faith. And this includes the need to disclose genetic test results, irrespective of whether they're from a clinical context, a research context, or even direct to consumer test results. The expectation is that they would be disclosed. Another feature of life insurance products, such as death cover, is that they are guaranteed renewable. This means that provided you maintain your premiums, if you get information after you've entered into that policy, there isn't a duty to advise an update. You would only need to share information, such as if you did have an adverse test result at a later date that indicated predisposition. you'd only need to share that if you were wanting to increase or change your cover. The final thing, and perhaps most important for this slide, is that life insurers in Australia have an exemption from the Disability Discrimination Act. What this means is they are lawfully allowed to discriminate on the basis of future health prediction, including on the basis of genetic test results, provided they have objectively reasonable basis for doing so, based on actuarial, statistical, or other data, other relevant factors. So that's kind of the legal framework as we have it. So to dig in and to examine, well, why is there a problem? And a key part of the problem is the self-regulated nature of the Australian insurance industry. We have the peak body, the Financial Services Council, and it sets its own policy, which has allowed the use of genetic test results. So they have a life insurance code of practice and a series of standards. These apply to members of the Financial Services Council. But there have long been concerns that, especially because of the self-regulated nature of the industry, combined with lack of government oversight, that this puts consumers at risk, and also as a consequence of fears of genetic discrimination, has the real problem of threatening to impede the progress of genomic medicine in Australia. I want to illustrate this by focusing on a few examples of documented cases of genetic discrimination. An early study published by Christine Barlow Stewart and David Keyes in 2001 in the Journal of Law and Medicine was one of the first Australian studies really to highlight this problem, and documented cases across a number of domains, mainly focused on insurance, but also other areas, highlighting the vulnerability of patients and consumers to genetic discrimination. And in fact, the media attention that publication received was one of the precipitating factors that led to the establishment of an inquiry by the Australian Law Reform Commission into the protection of human genetic information soon after. So Chris Barlow Stewart and I subsequently collaborated with others on a project that was funded by the Australian Research Council, the Genetic Discrimination Project, which sought to look at the problem of genetic discrimination in Australia across a number of domains, including insurance. And our specific objective was to go beyond what were reported, sort of anecdotally reported or anonymously reported cases. And we really wanted to dig in and see if we could verify instances of genetic discrimination. This was in response to claims in light of the earlier publication that, look, these are just anonymous, it's not verified, the problem's overstated and the like. What we really wanted to be able to do was to get an evidence base to give a clear picture so that we could informedly address the issue. And our project was able to verify cases. It was a complicated and challenging process, but we were able to do it, and we published on our results. And certainly life insurance was an area where we did identify problems. Some examples included, for example, where life insurers were not taking account of prophylactic measures, for example, where women had had a double mastectomy and that wasn't being acknowledged appropriately in the policies they were being offered. Problems with overly broad exclusions, for example, of all cancers for women who had the BRCA mutation, which went beyond the insurance exemption based on actuarial advice that we had received. Lack of actuarial or statistical data to justify decisions, even though that's actually a requirement under the exemption in the Disability Discrimination Act. Reliance on outdated information and a range of other problems. So we were able to establish, yes, it is occurring in Australia. It's something that needs to be addressed. And I'd like to also, in this context, mention another publication. It's one that Louise Keogh and I worked on jointly. It documents a case study, the story of James, who subsequently did speak more publicly in the media. James was a pseudonym, but it illustrates some of the problems of where the onus is in practice left on people to be agitating for their rights. So James had a genetic test for Lynch syndrome, which is a hereditary form of non-polyposis colorectal cancer, and he was found to be a carrier for this mutation, so he predisposition to this genetic disease. After disclosing this information in the course of life insurance applications, he was denied insurance, the type of insurance he wanted, in that they were excluding him for any cancer. What was significant about James's story was that as a professional with scientific training, he didn't just take no for an answer, but he decided to undertake his own research. So he read published epidemiological research articles, followed up with the authors in terms of his own circumstances, and he was able to calculate that his risk of colorectal cancer was the same as population risk, provided that he underwent an annual colonoscopy. He presented this information to a third insurer, but was again denied cover. And it was only when he brought an action in the Australian Human Rights Commission that he was offered full cover. So his earlier requests to the insurer to reveal the actuarial evidence that they were relying on were ignored, and they only acceded to his request and offered the cover after he brought discrimination proceedings. And the fact that they backed down so quickly suggests they really didn't have the actuarial data to justify their decision. So the ultimate decision by the insurer was appropriate, but it was only reached because of his tenacity in undertaking his own research and advocating for a decision based on the best evidence available, which he had been able to identify. So far from a typical consumer. And for me, and the reason I wanted to share this, the case highlights how in practice the burden is left with the applicant for insurer, the applicant for insurance rather than the insurer, even though legally to get the benefit of the exemption, the insurer should be making the case of why they have the actuarial, statistical or other basis for making an adverse decision. So against that background, in terms of why there's a problem, this information, this knowledge about genetic discrimination creates uncertainty and consumer fear about the financial implications of having a genetic test. And the fear itself then becomes a problem because it actively deters uptake of predictive genetic testing in the clinical context. And this is concerning because it means that it creates a barrier to preventive measures, and that's not only problematic for the individuals but also adding to disease burden for in terms of public health. Another reason it's a problem is that it also deters involvement for participation in research in circumstances where people get a result back. And it's well documented that information about the implications for testing does have a chilling effect on research participants. And it's almost paradoxical that, say, in the clinical context where usually genetic counselling would be offered before a person can undertake a genetic test, they are actually obliged to talk through all the pros and cons and the things that people have to take into account, including the implications for insurance. So every time the genetic counsellor speaks to someone, it raises the insurance concerns, and often people are given advice to sort their insurance before undertaking testing to avoid problems. And similarly, in the research context, research protocols would have to be advising people of the potential implications for insurance. So this is then feeding those concerns that may then create a deterrent effect. It's interesting that after the publication in 2001 of cases in Australia, it led to this inquiry, the Australian Law Reform Commission inquiry into the protection of human genetic information, and they made many recommendations. It was much broader than life insurance, but on this particular issue, an important recommendation was made that there should be a body established in Australia that would examine which genetic tests are suitable for use in life insurance underwriting based on their scientific reliability, actuarial relevance and reasonableness. and that there'd be a corresponding obligation on life insurers to only use those test results that had been approved for underwriting purposes. So essentially they were recommending a process for vetting, and that rather than just any genetic test, it would only be ones that had met a certain threshold. These recommendations were directed at government. It was to set up a new body, a Human Genetics Commission of Australia, to undertake this vetting process. In the government's response, however, they really just played down the significance of the recommendations, said, look, these are matters for industry to implement, and then nothing eventuated. And I think it highlights one of the shortcomings of industry self-regulation. So we don't have any constraint on the type of genetic test that can be used for underwriting. So to sum up so far, I see a problem at two levels. I see, certainly historically in Australia, there have been problematic cases of genetic discrimination outside of the exemption, and they're of course just examples rather than comprehensive. But more fundamentally, there can be questioning of, is it appropriate in any event for insurers to have access to genetic test results for underwriting purposes? So interestingly, if we look at overseas jurisdictions, we see that Australia has in fact been lagging behind, because a number of countries have gone forward either to restrict or outright ban insurers' use of genetic test results. So the United Kingdom has had a moratorium in place since 2001. It was negotiated between the British insurance industry, life insurance industry, and government. And it allows for people to get quite generous insurance, say life insurance for death cover up to £500,000 without having to disclose a test. And then above the threshold, they say, yes, disclosure, but only of approved test or vetted tests. And the only test that has been approved for this purpose is the test for Huntington's disease. So that's really significant. So effectively, no genetic tests except that one in the UK. In Europe, a number of countries, on the basis of the Council of Europe Convention on Human Rights and Biomedicine, have banned life insurers from using genetic test information. Similarly, in Canada, in 2017, they passed the Genetic Non-Discrimination Act, which restricts insurers' access to genetic test results, irrespective of whether they're from research or clinical settings. The US has for some years had the GINA, the Genetic Non-Discrimination Act. That is limited, however, to prohibiting use of genetic test results by health insurers. It doesn't apply to life insurance. And I mentioned earlier that in Australia, health insurance hasn't been our concern because of the community rating principle, which prevents individual risk assessment. While looking at the situation internationally, I thought it was perhaps opportune to mention this new body, the Genetics Discrimination Observatory, the GDO, an international network of researchers dedicated to researching and preventing discrimination based on genomic data. And it seeks to take a sort of a joined up international approach to the problem of genetic discrimination, also policy development, data collection and the like. And I'm currently the representative for Australia for this international body. So we come now to turn to look at Australian developments more recently. And a key sort of point in time was the development of this Australian Genetic Non-Discrimination Working Group formed in 2016, a multidisciplinary group with people with genetic and medical backgrounds, research scientists, law and bioethic academics and genetic counsellors. It was formed at the initiative of Associate Professor Paul Lakazi, a genomics researcher at Monash University, and he was, like others, including myself, was becoming increasingly concerned about the impact of genetic discrimination in practice. I was invited to chair this working group, and it included people I'd already been collaborating with, such as Christine Barlow-Stewart and Louise Keogh. Around about the time of its formation, there was a parliamentary inquiry into life insurance underway, and the group saw an opportunity to make a submission to this group to raise awareness about the problem of genetic discrimination. And when contact was made with the the committee, they were receptive, even though the issue of genetic discrimination wasn't expressly within their terms of reference. We made a written submission at the end of 2016, and then on the strength of that, we were Paul Lakazi, Jane Tiller, and I were invited to give oral evidence, sort of pre-COVID times, at a public hearing in Canberra. The reason I mention that is that this ended up being quite influential in their decision-making. The inquiry released a report in 2018 and acknowledged the concerns about the impact of the fear of genetic discrimination on uptake of clinical testing and also on research. Also recognised that this problem was going to be becoming more significant as we progress with genetics and genomics. And they recommended that as a matter of urgency, a moratorium be introduced banning the use of genetic test information for underwriting and life insurance. Now, normally the government would give a response to recommendations of this kind. Nothing of that kind has occurred. And I guess this has in part been because the situation has been overtaken by other developments. And this is where we sort of see the impact of the moratorium that was introduced by the peak life insurance body, the Financial Services Council, or FSC. So that body had clearly recognised, in light of those quite strong recommendations from the Joint Parliamentary Inquiry, that they needed to take some action, and that if they didn't, because another aspect of the inquiry was to say if the industry doesn't do this, we should just legislate with a complete prohibition. So what they did was voluntarily introduce a moratorium on the use of genetic test results in life insurance. And this came into effect on the 1st of July 2019. And it was in the form of an industry standard, standard number 11, which formally documents the moratorium and states that it will be in effect until at least June 2024. A review, and this is also in the moratorium, is planned for 2022 with a view to potentially extending that date, taking into account of a number of factors, including feedback from consumer groups and expert stakeholders, the appropriateness of the amounts of cover, rates of participation in genetic research, advances in the field of genetics and genomics, and impact of the moratorium on the sustainability of the life insurance industry. So clearly, at that point in 2022, when they review the moratorium, it's going to be really important that there's objective information available on how the moratorium is faring in practice to be able to inform that review. And that's certainly been a consideration for the research team that I'm involved with. The FSC put out a number of fact sheets, a fact sheet setting out sort of key aspects. It makes clear what is in scope. The moratorium applies to all genetic tests defined on the basis of testing a person's chromosomes or DNA. It's irrespective of how those tests have come about. It sort of makes clear that what individuals must do, they certainly have to disclose any diagnosis of themselves or of a first degree relative. Insurers, in terms of what their obligations are, they must not use genetic test results under the financial limits, and I'll come to those in a moment, only where a person chooses to declare a genetic test result. And that would be, of course, where it's favourable and can be used to offset a problematic family history. And over the financial limits, companies may use genetic test results, but it has to then be in accordance with the Disability Discrimination Act exemption. That is, they must have actuarial, statistical or other basis for relying on such results. Further information about what people don't have to do, there's certainly no obligation to have a genetic test at any point, regardless of the amount applied for, and that about research, you only need to disclose if you're going to get a result back. So research participation per se isn't a problem. And disclosure of family history is only is limited to first degree blood relatives, and certainly you don't have to disclose genetic test results of those people, only your own test result. Finally, there you'll see reference to the financial limits. 500,000 for death cover and total permanent disability cover, lower thresholds for trauma and critical illness cover. And certainly the relatively low nature of these financial thresholds is one of the concerns that I'll come to. So if we evaluate where we are with the moratorium, before we get to that, just to note, there is also this fact sheet that's been put out by the Centre for Genetics Education about the moratorium, and that's perhaps more directed to people who've either had a genetic test or are considering one. So evaluating the moratorium, it's undoubtedly of some benefit to consumers because not all genetic test results need to be disclosed whilst the moratorium is in place. So to that extent, it helps to reduce concerns about genetic discrimination. And it may be that people have previously been declined insurance or sort of set terms that were less than favourable. They can reapply, and now the insurer would not be able to use the adverse genetic test result for amounts below the financial threshold. And of course, for new applications, genetic results don't need to be disclosed, but individuals will need to disclose any diagnoses of themselves, of family history, of first-degree relatives to allow that usual risk assessment. So despite though the reduction in concern, there are still some troubling aspects. And part of this stems from the lack of government involvement, the fact that this was voluntarily introduced, completely self-regulated, and that it hasn't involved a change to the insurance exemption, only to this policy document, this standard that was introduced. And as a consequence of that, there's no real enforcement mechanism. The insurers have agreed to comply with the standard because they're members of the Financial Services Council, but it is merely a standard. The industry is in the process, as I understand it, of incorporating the moratorium into their life insurance code of practice, which brings it up to another level, which is mandatory for their members. But it isn't the same as being legally enforceable, which would only be achieved if there was legislation and an amendment, for example, to the exemption in the Disability Discrimination Act. So aside from that, there are other concerns. The financial limits are much lower, for example, than, for example, in the UK, £500,000 for death cover compared with $500,000. So it's almost half of the type of cover, and that's a concern that's been frequently referred to. Moreover, for applications above the threshold, in Australia, there's no limit on what tests must be disclosed. In the UK, I mentioned it is only the test for Huntington disease. In Australia, it's every genetic test, and this is because that important recommendation back some years ago for some vetting of what is suitable for use in life insurance underwriting never was implemented. Also, there's no research exclusion, even though research results, if there is a result given back, may not be from an accredited laboratory and may therefore lack the usual sort of scientific, actuarial and other relevance that we would expect in order for a result to be reliable. And there are other aspects of it as well. I mean, the moratorium runs into a number of pages. It's complicated, quite difficult to explain and for consumers to understand. And linked with that, its temporary nature, the fact that it is due to expire mid-2024, and that means that when counselling for people prior to a genetic test or participation in research, you can tell them about the moratorium, but you can't say that all the problems have gone, because you have to explain about the thresholds, and you also have to explain that if the moratorium is not extended, that after the moratorium, they would then possibly be required again to disclose genetic test results. So that creates complexity and uncertainty. And another factor is that it doesn't apply to travel insurance. It is only life insurance, and travel insurance involves risk assessment, but it is covered by general insurers rather than life insurers. So that's another source of confusion. So these sorts of problems have led to a desire by a bunch of people that I'm involved with, this group here, to gathered together as a project team led by Associate Professor Paul Lacasi to apply for research to undertake an empirical, interdisciplinary, systematic review of the moratorium. We came up with the sort of glamorous title of a Glimmer, which stands for the Australian Genetics and Life Insurance Moratorium, Monitoring the Effectiveness and Response. So Paul Lacasi is the lead, Jane Tiller is the project manager and researcher, and a bunch of chief investigators, people that I've often worked with before, and it brings together research scientists, academics, clinicians and policymakers, and some of whom have been working in this area for many years, including myself. And there's also a strong crossover with the former Australian Genetics Non-Discrimination Working Group that I mentioned, and effectively this project has now overtaken the work of that group. In terms of the project's goals and aims, I should mention that it's funded through the Genomics Health Future mission of the Medical Research Fund and had 3-year project funding, which commenced in 2020. The overarching goal is to ensure adequate evidence is collected to inform the review of the moratorium in 2022 and help to provide advice to government at the conclusion of the project on the appropriateness of the moratorium as a long-term regulatory solution for the use of genetic test results in life insurance. And particular goals, particular aims include evaluating the dissemination and awareness of the moratorium, its impact in a range of areas, including healthcare, research and the financial services industry, and also its adequacy as a long-term regulatory solution, given its self-regulated nature. In terms of project partners, what I can say is it's a very collaborative project, involves most of the people who've been involved in this area in a research sense. It's run through Monash University. We have academic and clinical leads who are all chief investigators on the project. We're also linked in with clinical and health partners, patient and consumer groups, and key genetic research and cohort studies, as well as having endorsement from a range of agencies, including the Victorian Department of Health and Human Services. And I should also mention, in terms of industry partner, we are working cooperatively with the Financial Services Council. In terms of our approach and study protocol, this in fact was published recently in a paper describing our objectives and methodology. We defined a particular evaluation framework that we would be using to systematically assess the impact of the moratorium for a range of stakeholders. And what we also sought to do was try and evaluate how can we measure the effectiveness of the moratorium. And this was based on thinking about what its aims are, and these were discussed between the Financial Services Council and our group, and essentially involve things such as removing genetic discrimination fears from being a barrier to genomic medicine, addressing consumer fears that impact on clinical uptake and participation in research, and minimising or eliminating genetic discrimination. And we also ascertained that to be able to measure whether those aims have been achieved, the moratorium would need to be able to demonstrate certain outcomes, including widespread and accurate awareness of the moratorium amongst a range of stakeholders, confidence amongst those stakeholders that the moratorium terms are being adhered to, regular policy updates as needed, and that the insurers who are applying the moratorium are adhering to its terms, that is, not using genetic tests below the threshold. So as part of this research study, obviously we want to make sure that it's well grounded in evidence. So a key part has been setting up specific data collection methods to gather evidence from key stakeholders, including consumers, health professionals, the insurance industry, as well as the genetic research community, to be able to evaluate achievement of these aims across these domains. So it's very much an evidence-based approach to be able to provide independent, objective data to ascertain the effectiveness of the moratorium as a long-term regulatory solution. In terms of the different research streams, this may be a little hard to read, but it is on our, we've got a Glimmer website. But the outer circle sought to portray the research that's been done to date before the study started. In fact, much of it has been by people who are now involved as chief investigators for this study. The inner circle concentrates on what is in scope for this study and the streams of attention. So stream A in the top left-hand corner is focused on health professionals, stream B in the right-hand corner on consumers. Then we have stream C in the bottom left-hand corner dealing with research, genetic researchers, and stream D in the right-hand bottom corner dealing with the insurance industry. I should also mention that we have ethics approval through Monash University and our partner universities. The first part of the study on which we've now already published relates to the health professionals survey. We had a publication earlier this year in the Journal of Medical Genetics that I just want to give you some sort of headline information from. So what we sought to do with this survey was to ascertain from health professionals who work in genetics and genomics awareness of the moratorium, their insight into its influence on patient decision-making in relation to genetic testing, whether, for example, it might lead to delay or decline of genetic testing based on insurance concerns, both pre and post moratorium, and also what their views were about regulation. And so the key findings, as highlighted here from the health professionals, most were aware of its existence, which was a very positive finding. They did perceive some improvement for consumers since its introduction, so some reduction in patients either delaying or declining genetic testing, which is also positive. However, broadly speaking, a majority still felt there were concerns about genetic discrimination and were supportive of stronger regulation. They believed that a moratorium should have government involvement, and that is the case in the UK, but not in Australia. And further, they were supportive of a stronger stance through legislation actually prohibiting or at least regulating the use of genetic test results. So in terms of where we're going next in next steps, we still have data collection underway in the other streams. In terms of consumers, in fact, just in the last week, an anonymous online questionnaire has been released, open to all Australians who've had or are eligible for a genomic test. And that's in fact on our Glimmer website if anyone wants to have a look at that. And separately to that, we've also, through the Australian Survey of Social Attitudes, we're also undertaking a survey of the public, the general public, to gain their views about life insurance and the role of genetic testing and awareness of the moratorium and views about regulation, using some questions that had been used with a previous study I was involved with some years ago, so we can also be measuring attitudes over time. In terms of the genetics researchers, a survey, an anonymous questionnaire will soon be administered to ascertain awareness amongst genetics researchers and their understanding of the moratorium, and also to evaluate the impact it is having on genetic research consenting processes and participant recruitment. In terms of the financial industry, we're going to be undertaking interviews with financial planners to gauge impact of the moratorium on their practice and their experience of clients seeking coverage when they've had a genetic test result. We'll also be undertaking focus groups, and we have a separate data collection to gauge life insurers' use of genetic test results pre and post moratorium, and also to be testing that they're only using those genetic test results for applications above the threshold in the post-moratorium area. And this data is being obtained with the assistance of the Financial Services Council because it's their member data that they help to collate. So broadly speaking, even though the Financial Services Council is a project partner, we are endeavouring to work at arm's length from them, because we want to ensure that our project data is as independent and objective as it can be, so that we can then provide that to the moratorium review, but also to provide it ultimately to government. Separately, we're undertaking an analysis of insurance, life insurance application forms, just to make sure they're not asking for genetic test information other than above thresholds. So that's also being undertaken. And we've got these two timelines of an interim report that we need to have ready in time for the moratorium review in 2022, and then our final report the year after, which will be then a synthesis of the data from the different project streams and an evaluation of the overall outcomes and whether the aims of the moratorium have been achieved, to be able to enable us to make evidence-based recommendations to government about where things stand and the effectiveness of the moratorium. So in conclusion, I really just want to reiterate the importance of an evidence-based approach to evaluate the effectiveness of the moratorium across the full range of domains, and that's what we're seeking to do through our data gathering. And of course, it'll then be in 2022 for the Financial Services Council to make its own call, hopefully taking into account our stakeholder information, whether they will be continuing the moratorium, and if so, on what terms. We, of course, will be then, actually, I think it should read 2023, not 24, reporting to government with our overall recommendation. So it remains to be seen where things land. Clearly, we need to have confidence that the concerns in the past of fear of genetic discrimination, barriers to genomic medicine are addressed. So they'll be important things to be assessing in order to be able to ascertain whether this is a satisfactory model going forward, or whether we need something stronger for the protection of consumers. Certainly for mainstreaming of genomic medicine in Australia, we need to ensure that any barriers or fears are satisfactorily addressed. So to finish up, I just want to draw attention to the project website, and also to acknowledge the research team, which I'm so pleased to be a part of, and particularly Jane Tiller and Paul Lakazi, who'd shared their slides from previous presentations, which I could draw on for some of the images used and the like. So thank you. And I'll stop sharing my screen. And hopefully there'll be, well, I look forward now to the views of the discussants, Larry and Loretta, and hopefully there'll be some questions.
Thanks very much, Margaret, for such an amazing talk. So it just looks such an amazing study and fills many a gap. Before we go on, I'd just like to mention to participants that viewers can click on the Eventbrite video to watch it on YouTube, where they can see the Q&A. So you will be able, participants can see the Q&A using by clicking on the Eventbrite video. And we again welcome your questions. So next, I'm going to go to our two discussants. So I'll introduce the first, who is Dr. Larry Croft. Larry is a bioinformatician with 27 years of experience. He's worked in academia and industry in the US, Malaysia, Denmark, Australia, and Switzerland. He's currently manager and associate professor of the Deakin Genomics Center. So Larry, let's go to you first with your reaction to the talk, to Margaret's talk.
Oh, there's lots of questions I've got. Yeah, there's a lot of things I didn't know there that are really sort of interesting me now. So a few things. One is originally there's panel tests. So you're testing a particular gene like the Huntington gene or that sort of thing. And that was basically because of cost. But now that the technology has taken a few leaps, it's actually pretty much now cheaper to sequence the whole genome than to do a couple of genes. So that will just become routine, as you just sequence the whole genome. And that data then, gets collected. So I guess the question is that then becomes a source of data for the insurance companies if they ever, if it changes, however the law, is determined, that data then can be used almost retrospectively. So if anyone's gone in for one test, they can, it's all there. Their genome has already been sequenced, and someone discovers a new gene, they can go, oh yeah, we'll just look it up in the whole population that's got insurance. But coming back to the actuarial work, so, and sorry about, I don't understand enough legal terminology to to put the question right, but so if the insurance company actuaries, do they have to, if the insurance company has its own information, it's not public, so say they've got bought from Google, 10 million genomes and medical data, or their own data they've collected over historical time, and they go, oh, okay, there's correlations here, we've run our machine learning through it, and there's correlations with these particular differences in the genome and these diseases. It's not public, it's not published. Do they have to disclose that? Can they use that to discriminate against people, even if people don't even know that result exists? I guess.
So I'm happy to try and answer that. It's interesting. There was one of the recommendations that inquiry made was that life insurers should give reasons for their decisions, because in the absence of a change, that wouldn't have been required. And to some extent, that's sort of in practice being taken up, but it doesn't extend to that kind of detail of, sharing their confidential actuarial information. Certainly if someone disputed something and took it to, say, the Human Rights Commission, they would need to sort of show, well, this is what we were relying on, and then there would be then perhaps more forensic scrutiny of the basis of their decision making, but it wouldn't normally be shared with the applicant in the event that they were making an adverse decision or something that they would have to disclose. So it's very closed in terms of an applicant, and often it's just been that, no, we're not going to insure, it's to do with your genetic test, but not kind of full disclosure on the insurer's side, even, which is sort of ironic given the extent of the disclosure that's required from an applicant. So very sort of unequal if you think of sort of an individual consumer and a big insurance company, and sort of misplaced sort of power basis, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a problem. Yeah, there's a lot of questions here as well. So, obviously most genetic tests at the moment, they're at the stage where you can find the same thing just by asking about their family. 90% of it you can say, have your relatives had any of these diseases, and you're pretty much covering most things. But as we get more data in the polygenic risk scores, which add a couple of percent here and there, and which can sum up to larger percentages, become better known, that becomes different, I guess. Yeah, I guess, that's not really a question, is it?
Interesting observations. I was also just trying to look at the questions in the chat. So yeah, sorry. I'm not sure if you wanted me to try. Yeah, not sure I can actually answer that as such.
Yeah. The questions in the.
We'll come to that. I'm sure we'll come to them after.
Yeah. Hand over to Loretta.
Should we go to? Well, I'll introduce Loretta now, if I can find my place. So thanks, Larry. So Loretta Duplevitz is retired from the QUT Law School, where the focus on her to focus on writing, research and teaching was on discrimination against Australian Indigenous peoples. In 2001 to 2002, she was seconded to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Unit in the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission. Now, to let the cat out of the bag, a paper written with her son, Dr. Larry Croft, Aboriginality Under the Microscope, the Biological Descent Test in Australian Law in 2002 for the QUT Law Review, has been widely cited, including recently by the New South Wales Court of Appeal, the Federal Court of Australia, the Australian Law Reform Commission, and many other publications. So over to you, Loretta, for your response and questions. Oh, can you unmute, please? Oh, yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Margaret, it's a moratorium. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
And I understand in other jurisdictions there are moratoriums, which seems to indicate to me that it's just for the moment. So is there any indication anywhere in the world where there actually is a ban?
Yes, it's an interesting point you raise. And moratorium does have that implication of something that is in for the time being. And yet, if we look at the UK, they have actually retained a moratorium that they introduced in 2001. So they review it every few years, I think, and make a determination. And they've actually said they favour the flexibility of a moratorium over legislation, which, of course, once enacted is in force. You can always amend or repeal legislation, but it's less flexible than a moratorium. In response to countries where they've taken a stronger approach, that would be the jurisdictions such as in Europe, Austria and Denmark, and some of those countries that have prohibited genetic discrimination. And also, I guess, particularly relevant for a country such as Australia, a comparable jurisdiction such as Canada, which now has a ban, complete ban, without thresholds of use of genetic test results by life insurers. And that was opposed by the industry, as you can imagine, at the time it was being debated. But since then, you know, we haven't heard of the sky falling in. And also in the UK and those European countries, and it's even though insurers will argue that their interests must be protected against adverse selection, and that's this idea of threshold, so it protects against very large applications. But it seems that overall it's not such an issue, particularly because insurers will still be able to use the information that Larry was talking about earlier about family history, and that will catch in practice most of the information. And there hasn't been the same sensitivity or concern about insurers relying on that information as with this sort of genetic test result that kind of gives this suggestion of precision and certainty, when really it's merely predictive information which can be easily misinterpreted.
Thank you.
I guess that that might change as the data gets bigger.
Yeah, and that's true, Larry, and that's probably why some jurisdictions such as the UK are comfortable with a moratorium that allows advancements in genetics and whole kind of assessment. You know, it allows everything to be taken into account, not just the consumer concerns, but also the implications for, you know, what about a time when we all just routinely have whole genome sequencing and know everything about ourselves, and what will the implications then be? Or does it, if everyone does it, does that level the playing field so that it doesn't become a problem for insurance? Or do we need to rethink how we organise insurance?
Can I ask another question? Have you got any examples of cases in Australia that have been published where people have succeeded against insurance companies?
It's something we endeavoured to do. I led back with that Australian Research Council funded project on genetic discrimination in Australia in the 2000s. I led the stream that was looking at the legal remedies, and it's very, very rare for an individual to take an action such as James and to the Human Rights Commission. So I did a comprehensive review of all anti-discrimination tribunal bodies around Australia, nationally and in the States, and very, very rare. There were some isolated examples. They weren't so much to do with life insurance, some other contexts. But what that the takeaway from that was that we have theoretically a legal remedy for people who can say, look, I believe I've been discriminated against. But to rely on that remedy really neglects the true landscape of individuals who experience these sorts of things. Often, if they have got this genetic mutation in their family, they might be, vulnerable. They might be, emotionally under pressure. And the idea of them taking litigation to assert their rights is just not where their mindset is at. So to point to legal remedies and say, look, that's the solution, actually ignores the reality. And it really points to, the better thing being to try to prevent the problem of unfair treatment in the first place. And this is why, there has been fundamental questioning. Is it even appropriate? Is it necessary for insurers to use this information and to expose people to this kind of risk and create the problem of people being reluctant to take necessary genetic tests because they fear the insurance implications? So, very, very few cases, Australian cases that have been documented. And I can't really think of a good example that's involved life insurance. There was one to do with travel insurance, which involves risk assessment. That was a published case, but not really so much in this domain, which I think is telling in itself in terms of relying on the law as a legal remedy.
Thank you.
Any other questions, Larry or Loretta? No, if not, then thank you for your contributions. And I will note we've got 3 questions from the audience, so thanks. Please keep them coming. First question is from Ashish Gozain. With reference to the trade-off between disclosure and privacy in context, genetic testing symbolized propensity as basis. Don't you think that the market failure based on propensity is weak institutionally and in terms of privacy concerns? What mechanisms are opposite?
I thank for the question, and it's obviously got a lot of depth to it, but I'm just not sure I'm really grasping it. So I'll endeavour to make some comment based on what immediately comes to mind. So the issue of disclosure is kind of sharing what you know about yourself through genetic testing. Clearly that has an impact on, your privacy, because something about you that is very personal and sensitive information in terms of this potential risk and so on is something that you are sharing. But because I mentioned earlier of the obligation of disclosure, there isn't really that choice. So I suppose the choice is, do you want life insurance? If you do, then these are the rules by which you need to play. And of course, now it's not that you have to share in all cases. It's only if you are applying for insurance above the financial thresholds, and that's to protect the industry from, what they see as large claims that could undermine the sustainability of the industry. The whole question of do people really go for adverse selection if they know more than the insurer based on genetic test result it's often put forward as an argument of why insurers must have this information, but there's not really very strong or convincing evidence that people act in that kind of very deliberate, financially opportunistic way. And there are many papers that are touching on this. So, for those who want to protect the industry and the institutions that it supports, they would argue for either allowing insurers to have access or at least setting a financial threshold so that they're protected from exposure to very, very large financial claims. But what's interesting to me is that in countries where they've taken a more interventionist approach and prohibited outright or set a financial ceiling that's actually quite high, such as in the UK, say $1 million cover for death cover, and in fact only one genetic test of something really specific and defined, such as Huntington, is the only test you'd ever have to disclose. They have not had problematic insurance consequences that have been reported, and I'm sure we would have heard about it if the institutions had failed. So Yeah, I'm not sure if that entirely responds, but that's what comes to mind at the moment.
Thanks, Margaret. Second question, which is good because it's similar questions that I had as well from Lara Azevedo. Does the FSC moratorium include epigenetic tests or only genetic tests? And I was thinking potentially there are other things like proteomic markers, metabolomic markers that are being used in the clinic and direct to consumer.
Yes. And certainly as we move forward, it's something that some of the people involved with the Genetic Discrimination Observatory have said, that in looking at issues for the future, we need to look at, well, is there going to be discrimination based on these other types of predictive information, even though they're non-genetic? And so perhaps we need to sort of think of changing our language of what's in scope. Certainly for the moratorium, it's quite specific. It is limited to genetic tests, which it defines as a test which examines a person's chromosomes or DNA. So it isn't broader than that. So what that would mean is that if tests of a different kind have predictive value, people would need to disclose them. An insurer would be able to rely on them because the moratorium doesn't apply, are subject to the insurance exemption that they can demonstrate either actuarially, statistically, or on the basis of other relevant factors, reasonable to take into account, that they can differentiate risk status on the basis of those other types of non-genetic tests. But there is a very real question, and I suppose we need to be gathering evidence of, is this a problem in practice? And if so, what should the intervention and response be? But I'm certainly aware that questions about this are being raised as new forms of testing and predicting future health status become available.
Thanks, Margaret. I mean, certainly from my point of view, a broader definition of epigenetics, which for those that don't know, it's the switches that turn genes on and off, but to put it basically, or as someone else has described them, the musicians that play the symphony of life on our genes. Epigenetics sometimes does come under the term genetics, and it's also chromosomes contain epigenetic information apart from DNA, so potentially epigenetics could be covered by the moratorium, and tests are rapidly moving moving forward through the clinic, and also for epigenetic tests, and also moving too quickly to direct to consumer testing, although the focus is meant to be all mostly about lifestyle. The other thing, I think, a short comment about epigenetics is, and other omics, is that although genetics is fixed, epigenetics is potentially changeable. So if an individual chooses to, or is treated in some way to reverse that risk, and that reversal is monitored by measuring their epigenetics at a second stage, then their risk will be substantially lower. And that also relates to that issue, Margaret, you were talking about interventions that might not be taken into account.
Putting forward favourable information, which an insurer must consider, and broadly, their policies on this in terms of what they must take into account, and more generally for life insurance, make clear they should always consider prophylactic or other interventions that lower risk. So there is theoretically an obligation to consider all those. And it may well be, I mean, given that the moratorium indicates as one of the criteria for review advances in the field of genomics and genetic testing, that might be an opportunity to review what's in scope, and if it's beneficial to make clear it encompasses epigenetic tests, then that can be made explicit.
Okay, thanks, Margaret. We have one more question at the moment. So before I go on to that, I'd encourage other members of the audience and the panel to have a think of other questions. So there's a question from Emma Koval. Great talk, she says. She's curious on how, Margaret, you've found working with the Financial Services Council. So they clearly have an interest in preventing regulation. How do you manage such conflict in the project?
Look, it's a really, thanks, Emma, for your question. And it's a really good question. And I guess my experience with this actually goes back some years, because prior to the Financial Services Council, it was called IFSA, Financial Services Australia. And they played a really key role. A guy called David Meeker, who's since passed away, was their kind of policy manager. And when Chris Barlow-Stewart, Sandy Taylor and I had done that earlier project, empirical project on the Australian experience to identify cases, they'd been essential to our work to give us access to data from the life insurance companies of their use and steps in their risk assessment. And it was only because we had their cooperation that we were able to get consumer accounts, link it with data that the insurance company provide, and then bring it together to actually say, look, we think this is a verified case. So the fact that they were entering into an arrangement where they knew that our purpose was to verify instances of genetic discrimination was, in a way, extraordinary that they were willing to have that exposure. And I think it was because the strength of leadership of David Meeker, and I know he got a lot of pushback at times from others, in the industry. Since then, we have the Financial Services Council. I think both bodies have been really strategic in their positioning. And if you look back, I know it's quite historic now, but that inquiry into the protection of human genetic information and how proactive the industry was in putting forward options and strategies for how they would do this better. And similarly, more recently, in the light of the recommendations that Australia needs a moratorium, rather than waiting for government to do something and perhaps enact legislation that's sort of an outright ban, for example, the industry said that we will act. They approached our Australian Genetic Non-Discrimination Group, which the report said they should do, and they said, we want your input, we will introduce a moratorium, we'll do this voluntarily. And in a way, it's sort of anticipating what might have happened without their agreement. They kind of seize the ground and do it on their terms. And I mean, right from the start, our group had given input that we were concerned that the thresholds financially were not that favourable for consumers. I'm sure they took some note of some of our feedback, but they very much sort of do what they think is in the interests of their members. And it's important we work together, because we won't have access to some of the data we need if we don't. And they were also, I think, saw the merit of being a project partner with our project, but they must also know that we will bring, hopefully an objective, independent and scrutinising eye on all the data and make recommendations. So it's a collaboration, but we fiercely maintain our independence. But certainly in a working sense, we do have fairly cordial and collegial meetings, and they see the need to cooperate, and we also need them. So it's kind of this understanding that we actually do need to work together, even though our objectives are quite explicit in terms of what we're doing and who we represent and so on.
Yeah, thanks, Margaret. I think that's a testament to the excellence of the Glimmer project. You've taken on that, that potentially tough customer, but really to have a group of different stakeholders with complementary interests. I think that's a great thing to do, because the companies and the insurers they want, to some extent, to a large extent, they probably want to be seen to be doing the right thing.
Yeah, for sure.
And they being part of the project get to actually see directly the opinions of the other stakeholders.
That's right. The other thing to mention, is this self-regulated element, and part of the motivation for the group in saying that we really should have a project to monitor what is happening. I mean, aside from the Financial Services Council agreeing to say we'll review and decide whether to continue, we just knew that if there isn't some independent oversight, and it's not coming from the government. I mean, the only involvement from the government, I guess I should acknowledge, gratefully we received government funding through the Genomics Health Future Fund, but there hasn't been a process of government for oversight of the moratorium. So it's only through this research project that there is this measure of objective, through data gathering. And I guess everyone with science backgrounds believes in, an evidence-based approach to evaluating outcomes.
Thanks. We have a follow-up question from Lara, who says, "Thank you, Margaret. I wonder if including epigenetic tests in the moratorium, the more evidence is needed, or is it possible to adopt a precautionary approach to avoid potential risks?" It's an interesting question.
Yeah, it is interesting, and I suppose it will depend a bit on the view of those reviewing the moratorium and its scope. I mean, potentially, given what you said, Jeff, about what epigenetic tests are about, that, can it actually already be included within the definition of genetic tests that I gave earlier? You might say that as a matter of interpretation, perhaps they're already covered. So, yeah, it'll be a case of looking at what's happening in practice with them. Is there some indication that this is now becoming relevant for risk assessment? Are insurers interested or asking about this information? Is there an indication that its use is becoming problematic, and that will then inform the decision? But yeah, my preference is often for a precautionary approach, and especially if it looks a bit similar to the sorts of things that have created problems in the past. So I think, to suggest a precautionary approach is sensible.
Okay, thanks. This segues nicely onto Emma Koval's next question. She asks, further to that, if someone did a genetic age direct-to-consumer test now, would they have to disclose that to insurer? Now, I'll just elaborate on that. There are different ways that it's been shown that you can measure your biological age, which is can be different from your chronological age. If you're biologically older, you're much more higher at risk for all-cause mortality and a number of chronic disorders. That can be measured through telomere length, the aglets on the end of the shoelaces of the chromosomes that start to unravel when we get old. And now it's probably the epigenetic aging test is probably the most advanced replicated epigenetic test. It's still in experimental stage. However, it has the dam is broken with direct-to-consumer companies. As 3 or 4 companies that are offering an epigenetic age test. Presumably, they may be also offering a telomere age test. So, if consumers have taken those, would they have to disclose them?
It's not something I've had to consider, and I suppose technically it comes back to, is it a genetic test, which in this moratorium, for example, is a test which examines a person's chromosomal DNA. That's what the moratorium applies to. More broadly, when you're applying for life insurance, I mean, you have to disclose things that are material or, have this relevance threshold to the application. And certainly, diagnoses and outcomes of tests, I can see why someone who has this and say it does show an age that gives them concern, that they might feel, oh, is this something I should share? And I suppose if you have that concern, it's probably, it's often safer to share it rather than have the concern you've withheld information that may then subsequently lead to the insurance being invalidated. But particularly with tests through direct to consumer, and as this isn't really, it's not directly a health test. It's kind of interesting. Right. It's sort of an indication of this genetic age, but it's not a recognised health test. So I think there would be a pretty good case to be made that you got it, for your information and personal interests, but it's not the same as having a medical test where it's obvious that you need to disclose that for insurance purposes. I mean, if you did disclose it, what would an insurer be able to do with this anyway?
Yeah.
It really makes you, ask and perhaps be concerned that if they did have it and use it, what would the consequences be? But it really tests that issue of materiality. And I mentioned also in the context of research and tests from unaccredited laboratories, and the fact that with direct-to-consumer testing and different providers, there's a real variability in reliability of test outcomes. So even though there's this assumption that a genetic test must be disclosed, I think we should be perhaps questioning, well, where is it from, and is it of a sufficient sort of accuracy, scientific validity, etc., to be meaningfully used? And this is where that key recommendation, which I've come back to a few times, that we should be vetting what can be used if they are going to be used by insurers, would be so important. And it was very much a compromise. It wasn't saying no use of genetic tests, but just saying, look, let's be clear on which ones have the veracity required for insurance underwriting.
That's such an important point. The interesting thing is the other side of the other end of the bell curve as well. Those that are being very careful with their diet and lifestyle. There's I think it's David Sinclair who's claims to have a biological age, 15, 20 years younger than his chronological age. You might want to actually disclose this, because you might get some discount from your
I guess go for it in that case and test it. That would be a good way to see, what the view of insurers are and whether they are. I mean, they've got to keep up with developments, including sort of scientific and others. And I'm sure there are some people who are giving this attention. I just, don't know where they've landed as yet.
You're right. I think what all the current direct-to-consumer epigenetic tests have, and maybe some of the genetic tests, is they're often a result of a single paper or one or two papers, or there's no clinical trial, no systematic review, no meta-analysis that the regulated tests go through. So there's a long way to go, but the companies and providers are launching those already in under the cover of kind of lifestyle tests just for fun, but that kind of is at odds with the images and the actual text they're producing on their site. But I think it seems to me there is that clear quality control that we can actually. It's easy to do, to look at the scientific literature and is this proven? And so I think that's a very good point. Any other questions from the panel at all? I had a couple of questions or points I think may be partially covered. I think one is the question about family history. There's not a whole lot of difference. Well, it's almost the same. Say a polygenic risk score that gives the relative risk for an individual based on hundreds of genes. Not much of a difference between that and someone's actual family history. So is genetics is it a standout measure, or is it just an example of a different kind of family history?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think it's because of the long-standing acceptance of family history information as being used. That it's fairly well established. We don't hear that much in terms of problems with its use, in contrast to genetic tests, which initially were quite novel, and sort of questions about, well, is there really a sufficient evidence base in terms of actuarial or statistical data, for example, with the BRCA mutation, and sort of early indications of what level of risk, and then that was reassessed and it was then later reduced. And the concern that in practice, this would be detrimental to consumers because people would be using these tests, sort of treating them as scientific evidence. They would be given a stronger probative value than was warranted because they are sort of medical tests, and not that it's merely a predisposition and just a concern that there would be too much weight on them, and ultimately consumers would be disadvantaged. And particularly because by not using them, you're not saying you have no information. The default is, well, you have the family history, and that was fine to use in the past. So what's the problem with just relying on that and being cautious about the use of genetic test information? So it's really, I guess, a balance and a recognition that because there are some problems if we allow insurers to use this information, that where does the balance sit when you weigh up the pros and cons? And at the moment, yes, many jurisdictions or many commentators support the view that some restraint on insurer use is necessary, particularly if we want to embrace genomics into healthcare more broadly and avoid any apprehension, whether it's well-founded or not, for people, to hesitate to take up a recommended test or to participate in research.
Loretta, did you have any other questions?
No, I don't have any. No, there's other questions I could ask, but I think,
I've got one final question. I think we're coming close to the end. I may not have caught this, but often for genetic testing, it's those disadvantaged people in the community, people with a disability, that often come off worst. Are you covering those stakeholder groups in your study?
I guess we don't look at it from the point of people with disability as such, because we're really talking about people who are at risk rather than have an existing condition. Having said that, they may be part of a family where there has been a line of disease, which is why they are taking predictive genetic testing. So the very fact that you have a susceptibility, say something like Huntington disease, where it's actually a 50% chance if you have the gene, that's a fairly sort of heavy burden for people to carry. And then, the issue of do they want to know, and the test, especially because there's not, unlike with some conditions where screening can protect you or perhaps allow early intervention, with some things that's not possible, such as Huntington's, which is this sort of autosomal dominant condition. So it very much depends, but typically, we certainly have networks, particularly those looking at people with family cancers in their history, and no doubt some would go on to then suffer cancer, but the focus is on the susceptibility to risk, genetic risk, rather than a disabled group. But it really depends how you interpret that. And I guess even having a mutation sets you apart in a way. So if you take a broad view, then we are involved with some of those groups. It was kind of part of who are our project partners and the various consumer groups and health groups that we're associated with.
I guess a follow-up to that is in terms of not groups of people with particular disabilities, but I guess, have you considered looking at particular ethnic groups or groups that might have a particular susceptibility to particular, domestic issues?
Actually, it hasn't broadly come up for the purposes of our review of the moratorium, but certainly it's been well documented. Tay-Sachs disease among African Americans, certain risks that people with Jewish ancestry are susceptible to. So it is documented that there are some particular susceptibilities that are linked to ethnic or sort of ancestry, but we're just looking broadly on the moratorium in practice for all users, and it's not, at this point, it may come up as we progress, but at this point it hasn't really honed in on particular ethnic groups. But I'll now that you've mentioned it, I'll be keeping a good look out for it if it does arise.
Yeah, that was one of the questions I was going to ask, because
Sorry, Larry, we're getting to the end.
yeah,
It's up to 11:30 now. Sorry to cut you off, but I'd like to thank Margaret for her excellent thought-provoking talk. I'd like to thank Larry and Loretta for their reactions and their questions, and all the others, Lara, Emma, Ashish, and Neera for their questions as well. So thanks, and I wish you and the Glimmer study all success.
Yeah, look, thanks. I'll pass that on.